He said, Diana and I are going to do a bit of tag team up front. And as we thought about what would make sense for this follow-up webinar, we decided that many of you have seen the slide that's on right now, which is the IES practice guide, about which I'll speak in a moment. But what we wanted to do was draw from our collective experience, myself as a researcher, Diana as a professional development provider, to provide examples of good things and not so good things that we have encountered in schools, districts, states around the country, to concretize some of the ideas that we're presenting. And then after we're done, it really gets to the meat of this, of hearing from the ground of the people who are really working in the schools in using data, because these principles are the reality check. So with that, I just want to introduce, for those of you who may not be aware of or familiar with, the Institute of Education Sciences develops practice guides, which are based on credible research sources. And the one in which I participated back in 2009, hard to believe it's been that many years ago, was to look through all of the research at that time on data-driven decision-making, and much more has appeared since then because it's really taken roots. Now, I want to preface my comment by saying data use is not the panacea. It really involves people's content knowledge, people's pedagogy knowledge, so it really is a combination. And one of the things that my colleagues and I at WestEd, with Diana's expertise, have been doing over the past year and continuing, is to define what it means for teachers to be data literate and what are the skills and knowledge that are involved. And we firmly believe that it is a triangulation among data skills, people's content knowledge, and their pedagogical content knowledge. But what we found in 2009 were about 3,000 pieces of research from which we discerned 5 recommendations, and you see them on your slide right now. The first is an ongoing cycle of instructional improvement, and by that we mean that data-driven decision-making is not a linear process. You collect the data, you make a decision, you see what happens, and then you're done. It really is an iterative cycle where you may need to go back, collect more data, ask other questions, and cycle through rather than just stop after you've made a decision. And that's true for a classroom teacher, that's true for an administrator, that's true at the State Department and even in the federal level. The second recommendation was somewhat of a surprise to us, but that students should be their own data-driven decision makers, that teachers should work with students to help them understand expectations, look at their own data, and become engaged and involved in looking at their own data. It improves in many ways, and basically a lot of this comes from the special ed research, where they've been doing data-driven decision-making much longer than the people in general education. The third is to establish a clear vision for data use, and I cannot emphasize this enough. The more that a superintendent, a building leader can make clear why people are using data, what is expected from them in using the data, and have a consistent vision that everyone knows about and is aligned with school improvement plans, this is absolutely essential. Following from that is a logical extension about the provision of resources and supports to enculturate data within a school or a district. And Diana and I will give you some of those examples going forward, but they're things like providing for common planning time, providing for appropriate professional development opportunities, having a data coach, a data team, the sorts of things that Diana does so well in her professional development. And finally, there is the need for a district data system. And this is really emerging because at that point in 2009, many of the technologies that are now available were not even on the horizon. And the question was, should a district build or buy a system? Now there are so many integrated systems out there that it is really essential to have the kind of data system or data tools that support the needs. And particularly because this is for the Rural Alliance, stress that it could be an Excel spreadsheet, it could be more. Many states across the country, and I know that we have a national audience, not just for the Oklahoma Rural Alliance, are providing dashboards that provide real-time data to teachers in their classroom. Other states in their statewide longitudinal data systems are even having a set-aside area that can serve as a proxy for very small districts or very challenged districts where they can provide technological resources that might not be available in those districts and schools. Diana, I will turn over the next slide to you.
All right. Greetings, everyone. Again, we realize that many of you were not present when we did the last, when we did the first event, part one. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was just sort of quickly summarize and go over the points that were made there for those who did participate and yet may have been, you know, interrupted during that time, and then especially for those of you who weren't able to be with us in the part one. And so today is just sort of a refresher of some of those with clear examples, again, from the practitioners where we work. One of the things that I wanted to add to the introduction that Heidi gave you is that, yes, our work, like much of the work that many of you are doing, has been informed by our research, supported by National Science Foundation, by the U.S. Department of Education, by several private corporate foundations that have been funding educational work. But for the most part, like many of you who are in the professional development work and field yourselves, all of this has been informed by the day-to-day work out there in the schools, you know, where we're flying from our office to, you know, your schools around the country, and working directly with you in very unique contexts across the country. And most of that work is all funded by all of you out of your professional development budgets, and we know at what a high price it comes because there are just too few dollars to support what you're doing. But I say that to say this, is that this is the information that we learn and how the field is being shaped because of your actual experiences, and that's what we want to be able to talk with you about here today. So our focus today is on clear examples from the field about how different schools and systems have actually implemented the recommendations from the practice guide as they are working their way toward what amounts to major culture shifts in how schools go about doing their work, how we collect the evidence to see whether our work is having the impact that we desire, and then how on an ongoing basis we continue to relook at that evidence as a teacher on a day-to-day basis or right in the middle of the lesson, collecting that information from students, whether it's a brief thumbs up, thumbs down, you know, asi, or whether it's a card check, or whether it's some other method that you have of collecting information right in the moment to see, are they getting it, are they not? And all of these things are a very intricate, complex system that needs to have intentional planning in order to pull it off. And some of you will see areas where you've already started down that path and been successful, and we hope for others that it will highlight some new thinking for you. At the same time, one of the things that I want to be clear about is that when we share best practices and when our principals share best practices, it's never the expectation that you're going to actually implement exactly what they've done, exactly how they've done it, and said, oh yeah, we should try that. Your context is going to be unique, and so it's going to take your careful, intentional planning about how to take the basic elements of an idea and how can that work in our context. And we applaud you for the ways that you take it and make it your own. So, Ellen?
Okay, now this will start some of the examples that are drawing from our experience. And the first one, and this goes under leadership, is for a building principal and the superintendent to provide appropriate resources And we know that budgets are tight. Data is a four-letter word for many. Time is a four-letter word for many. Cost is a four-letter word for many. I think education must be steeped in a lot of four-letter words. But in all seriousness, the provision for professional development is really at the heart of it. And the research is very clear that it shouldn't just be a one-time shot. It should be ongoing and continuous, and it should be aligned with the goals of your particular needs and schools. The kinds of data coaches with whom Diana works, of having an individual who can lead the data charge within a school, having people who are knowledgeable about data entry. And an example that I'm going to give comes from some charter schools with whom I've been working. As Heidi mentioned, I'm working in some blended learning environments. Having teachers have the ability to enter their own data and know what they are and have a system that will support those kinds of locally relevant data will really make a difference, rather than being, I hate to say foisted upon, but having data that are less relevant to the instruction or to the school data culture. So provision for PD, having data coaches, having a data team, having common planning time where the data team can support their work, and having technologies that support that are really important. Going hand in hand with that is when you're working in a data team, and this is a message to all the building administrators out there, to create an open and trusting environment, because the kinds of discussions that go on in data teams require frank and open discussion among colleagues. Somebody may say, I'm really struggling with this particular student. Can anyone help me? Has anyone had experience with this student? And they seek advice from colleagues. You don't want that kind of open dialogue to come back and bite the educator in the butt when it comes to evaluation, or somebody to mock them and say, ha ha ha, Ellen is really struggling in knowing how to deal with her students. So trust, the ability to have those kinds of discussions when it's necessary, and that is absolutely critical. Diana, you have the next bullet.
Yes, and this one is going to introduce a video that we're going to see. And so this is going to be an example of one of those practices that schools have found to be incredibly useful in getting a whole faculty engaged around our focus on student learning. How far are we from our goals? Who's getting it? Who isn't? What aren't they getting? And how as a whole school do we respond to that? And in this video, as you look at it, consider not whether in your small school setting or your large school setting, whether you actually have a schedule right now this year that will support this. It may not be possible. But what are the other events between now and the end of the year? As your teachers begin to plan for when you come back in August, what are the events then that are the opportunity for bringing faculty together, and being able to, as a whole school, look at our data together and then together share the meaning of this and come up with plans for how we're going to respond. Many schools use, in addition to the model that we're going to see, a release day once a quarter, once a semester, and they call it Data in a Day, where the entire faculty are all in their learning teams, their grade level teams, their department teams, and drilling into the data that they have currently and planning where they're going from there. Other smaller schools in settings where they're not able to have those full day release days have scheduled time so that one morning a week or one afternoon a week, teachers are meeting for a 45-minute time in a common planning time where their teams are coming together, where all of the instructional teams are coming together, as well as specialists, in order to coordinate their planning and follow through on what they're learning that week about where their learners are. So let's look at this video, and from it, what are the elements that the school is attending to, and where are the opportunities that you might have for that?
Data has been integral in our growth as a staff because I think a lot of times we look at students, we look at what we're doing, we kind of move along, and it's easy to make assumptions. So it's easy to think, well, gosh, our kids are doing great, or all of our kids, we can lump kids into one giant category. It's pretty typical that a school like Mount Baker, the test scores will improve, and at some point they're going to plateau. What that tells us is that we need to go deeper, and we need to go to more specific levels, student by student. A data carousel is a process that involves all of the staff. The leadership team chooses the most important data for us to look at, and then the staff actually walks through and looks at the data displayed on charts, and they write narrative statements that tell exactly what the data says. And then we look at the strengths and the concerns, and then other questions that we need to ask from more data.
07 bilingual students were at like 5% meeting standard, and in 08 they went down.
I hate to see that. I don't know if that's the same. But I believe it.
Across the board. Yeah.
There are a couple of ways that we use data carousels to inform instruction. One is to get a global picture of how our students are doing in general, and then to provide data for teachers and staff members to look at that gets into the more fine nuances of how students are doing.
Because every year we do a data carousel, so we take all our test data, we put it up on the posters with all the information, grades, and by strands. So we were looking at a specific strands of probability and statistics, and we were really looking at the statistical part. So we had narrowed it down specifically, and then you just look at your test results.
Let the gaps stay in the same.
Through our data carousel process, we determined that our math scores were flat and that we needed to find out why. So we dug deeper into that data, and the math team then determined that the area of statistics was a very weak area that we could do something about.
What we had to decide was, we can't do this all on our own. And we know that we had a good support from our team, not only our math team, but our school team, that we knew that we could count on them to help in some way.
So our leadership team had an aha that actually if we were able to incorporate that across the curriculum, that would really support our students' learning. The math team collaborated with the content teams and provided themselves as a resource. They did some coaching, and consequently there were a lot of really creative ways that teachers integrated mean, median, mode, and range into their teaching. They wove those into science and into reading, language arts. If you would be willing to incorporate or integrate these statistics in your curriculum, we could really make a difference, we believe. So teachers were open and receptive to go into our classrooms and integrate those strategies.
We only do writing in language arts class, right guys? Wait a minute, this is language arts class, so aren't we supposed to just do writing? This is where I just want to give you some background. Mrs. T and I got together and we said, we need to do something about this. So I went to her begging and pleading for her to come into my classroom and help out. So here's something that we've been working on. So I'm going to let you take it from there.
So what I'm going to show you here in just a moment is all of the data from all of the classes, not just your class, but second, third, fourth, and sixth period. All of the scores that you got on the rocket plane, Here Comes the Rocket Plane, and then the Friendship Orchard. Remember, you did those 2 stories and then you made graphs on those 2 stories. So you've made those graphs already, right? So we're going to skip ahead to the part that's kind of the tough part sometimes, is the analysis of a graph. So take a look at this graph here. Our target said we're going to be comparing 2 sets of data using a double bar graph. So if this is a double bar graph, what makes it a double bar graph?
That there's 2 bars there, and one's the total scores of rocket planes, and the other one is total scores of Friendship Orchard.
What do we call these things that are labeled here? What are these?
There are variables.
They are our variables. I think what blew us away was how many people tried it and were excited about doing it. Like, woohoo! We got everyone to love math for just a moment. It was great.
We went from a minus, I think it was about a -10. When you look at the trend data in that area, students progressing about 5 points the first year, and then we said, this is working, let's try it again.
We saw a statistically significant change in the increase in the number of students making standard in the statistics piece based on the work that we did in the leadership team.
And then we have anecdotal stories from teachers that are exciting about how students reported that they were understanding this so much more. They could do this so much more easily. We were able to respond by doing something to change our instruction in the classroom, and we saw impactful results.
And we're hoping that many of you were able to see in that the actual discussions that were taking place and what that gathering, that data carousel was able to enable. Well, what are the mechanisms, whether it's informal meeting times, whether it's faculty meetings, whether it's structured meeting times, what are the opportunities for bringing faculty together to focus strictly on who's getting it, who isn't, and what aren't they getting, and what are the things we can do differently that are going to help kids be able to understand these concepts and be able to apply them in different contexts. Ellen?
Good. We'll transition a little bit to data systems right now, because those are a particularly touchy subject, as I mentioned earlier, for small, rural, and poor districts. We're going to give you a couple examples, and they come from a variety of small to large districts of where, what can be done and what some of the issues may be around them. And the first bullet comes from an example from Florida, where a district created a data system in which the teachers could only use the system on-site and with district computers. And so it was the issue of the ease and accessibility of data use. And this is a real problem because, as many of you know, teachers tend to work not just in the school but at home in the evening, answering questions and accessing data. So we urge you to consider data systems that are accessible from wherever, but of course keeping the appropriate privacy, confidentiality, and security issues in mind, because educators need data when they need the data, and that may be as they're looking at homework in the evening and grading them and have a pressing question about, how has this student done in the past. So that is one caveat around data systems. Diana, you have the next one.
Well, one of the things that's critical in helping teachers understand and feel confident in their use of data is getting the professional development they need just in time. So often, and this is what I've been doing for, 30 years now, is providing professional development. It's planned way in advance. It's on an agenda based on, current perception of needs. And we plan out the year's program and we, line it all up and it's going, it's running. but teachers need to see the relevance, and it needs to be relevant to the work that we're doing today. So if we're looking at our student data and we're finding out that in 7th grade, 6th grade, 5th grade, our students are having a great deal of trouble with fractions, decimals, and percents, and teachers go back to the, well, what does this learning look like? What do they need to know? And teachers come to the conclusion, you know, I've been only teaching fractions as a part of a whole, and it seems to me that students from a very young age need to begin to be introduced to fractions as a ratio, because that really is opening up the door then for them understanding the connections to the other ways of using their knowledge. So getting that help to them right in that moment, in having the math specialist, the university partner, the IU partner who can come in, a master teacher from another school who can sit down with teachers right in that moment and be able to show them a different way of looking at this, or finding online resources that could help teachers right in that moment. And the same with the professional development around their data systems. So often the school district or county purchases the new data warehouse reporting system. They get everybody set up with the data dashboard, and there'll be a one-day, y'all come, you know, sit in an auditorium somewhere where someone else is demonstrating the use of the system and how to go in and access the information and manipulate it. But teachers aren't sitting with their own class list. They're not sitting with the most recent set of exit tickets that they just did. And so they have no, you know, way to actually work on, act on what they're doing. One of the school districts that we worked with for several years had done just that, and they were finding as they checked logs that very few teachers were logging into this really nice data system that had been set up for them, until we had begun to work with them on analyzing their data. And once they began to realize the timeliness of this and the usefulness of the data, they then were like, well, now I wish I could get that person back over here to show us how to actually use the system, because the menus are confusing. And at that time, the district office responded, and they sent professional development staff on demand to the schools who sat down in a school, meeting with teachers during their planning period throughout the day, sitting with the teacher's own class list, their own data, and going through the instructions while teachers highlighted each piece of the little packet so that they could do it on their own. It was relevant, and it was just in time.
Okay, I have the next bullet, and this is about providing the kinds of data that teachers need in their classrooms to most inform their instruction and work with their students, and to get the students involved as well. And it goes back to that second recommendation in the IES practice guide about students becoming their own data-driven decision makers. And this example comes from the state of Arizona, where the Arizona Department of Education is providing data dashboards and developing them for all of the districts and all of their many charter schools around the state, to provide real-time data that occur in the classroom immediately, both as an instructional tool, as a time-saving device for teachers, and to better engage the students. And what they do is enable technologies that are aligned to the standards, in which a student may be taking a benchmark exam or a teacher-made exam, and immediately they're seeing how the students are doing, groups of students or individual students. The students also see their performance so that they know how they're doing and where the issues might be. The teachers have all reported to me that it is a tremendous time saving. It's not that they couldn't do these kinds of analytics on their own, but they know to what standards are particular items and exercises tied. They know what they need to teach and reteach. They have the analytics that are provided to them. And when I ask, can you do this on your own? They say, absolutely, but it will take forever. So the provision of these kinds of tools that enable them to really concentrate on what teachers should be doing, which is working with the students and progressing with their instruction and student learning, and taking away some of the onerous tasks of analytics that are being done behind the scenes in these kinds of data dashboards and data systems. So there's another example of a good side of data and data systems being possible for people. The next area which we would like to cover is about team building, time structures, and sort of the strategic nature of using data teams. And a couple examples that I'll give before turning it over to Diana is about data teaming. And it's ironic that I'm talking about it because I've observed it as opposed to what Diana does for a living, which is working with teachers and schools to enable them to become a data team, is that you can consider both vertical and horizontal data teaming models. Examples might come from elementary schools where you can have teachers from various grade levels coming together to discuss the progression of particular students over time. So the third grade teachers talking about how students have progressed and being informed by the second grade teacher of what those students were able to do in the past year and looking forward to what might happen in the fourth grade, as opposed to horizontal teams which may occur more in a high school, perhaps in middle schools, where it's really about horizontal teaming around a particular grade topic. So maybe all the algebra teachers in a high school coming together to talk about what's working in their instruction, looking at how the data look from a particular topical area or unit that's being taught. So we urge you to think broadly about what the structure of your data teams might be and what works for you in your school setting. Diana?
Yes, and one of the other considerations that is absolutely critical, and it's a challenge in charters or other small schools where there's basically one teacher per grade level and few specialists in the building. But by whatever means you can, orchestrate the ability of your core teachers, classroom teachers, subject area teachers, as well as your specialists and non-tested subject area teachers to meet routinely to ask the big questions about the learning and what is happening with our learning, with our students' learning, what are we doing differently, being able to coordinate it across specialists, whether your specialists are inclusion coming into the classroom or whether they are intervention specialists meeting with students at another time. It all has to be woven of the same fabric so that everything is working together to create the experience that every single learner needs. Rethinking schedules, and this is a good time of the year to begin to think about next year and the kinds of changes that you might be able to make to take advantage of the fact that you may have an art teacher who circulates between both elementary and middle school, or a gym teacher who comes to the middle school from the high school. How can we use that 1 or 2 hours that they're in the building or other times, formally or informally, in order to put people in the same place at the same time, working the work together? We have examples of schools where they've actually changed the way classrooms are assigned to physical spaces so that the physical spaces are assigned by the working groups, putting them in closer proximity so that even during those brief periods of time when you're in the hallway doing hallway duty between class passing and so forth, there is that opportunity to exchange information about particular students' work and engagement during that particular day's lessons. Thinking about alternatives to traditional schedules. This is something we all need to go back to the drawing boards to say, if we were going to build a schedule that supports the kind of interactions that we need for our students and the kinds of interactions that we need for our faculty, how could we make this different than it is and has been traditionally? And you're going to hear Jana and Vicki talk about something that they've done in their school to address this. So in this next video, one of the things that we want to highlight, this is from a turnaround school that vastly changed their practices. You know, they were a school in improvement. They had set really high goals for themselves. And one of the keys that they found was distributed and shared leadership throughout the building, so that leaders were in the classrooms, teachers were being supported as leaders as the PLCs met, and then listen for the parts about real changes and shifts in teachers' thinking from what their traditional culture had been prior to embarking on this new vision that they had for their school and for learning with their students. I experienced this just recently in a small school where a teacher who actually is getting ready to retire within, well, by the end of this year, although I'm hoping she'll reconsider that now. But she's a first grade teacher, and for her, the class has always been best when she has an opportunity to teach and do a lesson. Then she puts the children into their groups. They're all busy, or they're busy at their tables. They're working individually or in groups, and it's a quiet classroom. And she recently undertook to shake that up by really sitting down throughout the day with different groups herself, those groups that were going out to the Title I tutor. And in doing that, it was a tremendous amount of learning for her. And as she began to give the other groups of students independent work to do and group work to do, and heard this healthy buzz of work going on, she said at first it was unnerving. She liked a quiet classroom. This is the way she's taught for 35 years. But when she realized the energy and that the kids were purposeful in what they were doing, she began to relish this and began to look at her students in an entirely new light. So listen here as you hear how these teachers at the Doran have tackled this.
If you are a school that's going to be going through this process of coming out of a level 4, I think the mindset is so important that you think about what you can do, you know, to change things. You're not looking at what the child can't do. You're looking at how you can change and reach that child. And I think that, you know, we all have that mindset here, that every child can learn. And we'll take them from where they are to where they need to be.
I think year one really was about systems building. So we created, obviously, our teams. We used to meet, but I think it was more informal. And we made sure that everything we did had a purpose. And we were tracking and documenting all of our work.
There's definitely expectations. When you come every 6 weeks, you have to have your data, you have to have your attendance sheets. In the past, you might say, well, this student's struggling. Okay, we knew that 6 weeks ago, but what has changed over that time?
The teachers now they have data walls in their classroom of various different data points, and the kids have folders with all of their data in it, and they have data conferences with each student saying this is where you were, this is where you need to be, in setting goals. That's empowering for kids. So now they know where they are and they know where they need to be.
It's really about what we're putting in front of kids, and really about being thoughtful about the instruction and the tasks, and really listening to where children are, because the student work is really our barometer for what is happening in the classroom.
The biggest idea that you have to share with your classmates, if I said pick one thing that you wanted to share about this investigation, what would you share?
That we share the number line.
Number line, what do you think? We give them a type of problem, and what they know at the end of each class is they're going to have to share out. So what did I learn from this? Did I get stronger in one area? What type of models did you use? What type of strategies? And they're almost writing their own objectives, because there's so many different entry points. When you look back and see the different groups that I met with, one group was just focusing on, am I dividing 125 or am I multiplying it? Whereas a separate group was saying, well, I'm going to use this number line, but maybe they're working on how to partition that number line. So each group has their own entry point in what they were learning.
We knew that if we invested in teachers, at the end of the day, the teacher matters. So if we have good quality instruction going on in classrooms, we would be able to move the building. We ended up with these teams in 3 to 8, and Diane and I would facilitate weekly common planning time. So we ensured that we had a schedule that was aligned so that teachers could meet, they could look at student work together, they could discuss data, develop action plans based on their data.
Like what I know now, I think teaming is so important, and also creating a culture of collaboration and transparency. Our staff, communication is a huge piece of our work. Our staff owns the work at Doran.
All right, and before we go forward, Heidi, I just want to do a time check here because I don't want to shortchange the amount of time that we have for Jana and Vicki to share.
I think we've got about 10 more minutes.
All right. Then one of the things that you know, I'd like to highlight, you know, for your collective thinking is how do we support this work and get it down at the individual teacher level. Many of us have first-year teachers, novice teachers. How are we supporting them from the moment that they begin their teaching experience? How are we introducing them to our school's vision for using data, and how are we supporting them in what kinds of data to gather, and then bringing them into the team or the PLC in order to work as a group, so that they begin from the basis of team inquiry, and then based upon what the team has decided and how the team has analyzed the work, then what are they getting for support, and what are individual teachers on that team, whether they're novice or veterans of many years, to taking what the team has done and applying it to their own classroom setting, to each individual student, and corresponding then how are they collaborating with the specialists so that they're coming together on a very focused individual plan for how they're going to carry out instruction that's going to meet the needs of every learner in their classroom. And how are we going to sustain that? How are we going to sustain it from year to year? Changes in leadership, changes in team composition, other structural changes that come about because of budgetary context or construction context as it happens in some schools. How can we very carefully plan how that teamwork and then getting it down at the individual level is going to be sustained? How can we use the physical context of our school and our structures to be able to support greater communication? Is it a matter of using some of the electronic tools, social media tools, Google Docs, in order to set up sharing where team meeting time is really minimal and focused on, you know, the data that we're looking at right now? What are the other means that we can use to support that ongoing communication?
Let me just add to what Diana has said and going back to that slide. Two things that are particularly important, especially for teachers who have just come out of their preparation programs, that they're going to feel like they're drowning in data. And even people who have been trained in data skills in their pre-service preparation, they need to understand that what they're doing in the classroom is data-driven decision-making, even though they may not be cranking through numbers in the evening. That doing formative assessments and understanding where their students are is a form of data-driven decision-making. And further, and this is really important for the sustainability and the enculturation of data, is that a study has found that whatever happens in schools of education in terms of preparing teachers to go out into the real world pretty much gets washed out because of the culture of the schools into which they're being placed. So if teachers, and not many have, and I always ask this question when I'm face-to-face with audiences, how many of you have ever taken a data course? And usually it's a few, but in the instances where they have been trained, some of those skills will wash out if the culture of data use is not embedded within the school where they're now teaching. So urging you to create these kinds of data cultures to make sure that the data skills don't get lost. In terms of bringing the students in, and this is really important, as we said before about getting the students to examine their own data, having the data in a way that is understandable to students is really, really important. In a way to communicate, having expectations, having rubrics against which they can match their progress. A fundamental principle of data-driven decision-making is to use multiple measures, not just one, so that you're triangulating and understanding that this is just not a one-time shot where a student may have really done well or not so well, as a way of mapping student progress. And one way, and this is occurring in at least one university that I am familiar with, is using student teacher work samples as a way to monitor student progress. It is a way to link their teaching with the standards and what's happening with their students. Very clear way to map the progress of students using concrete data that are relevant to the classroom. Diana?
Well, and in analyzing student work, I know a lot of schools and schools that I've been in conversation with this week, one of their biggest concerns is, well, we're trying to find a good assessment system. And there is a place for that, for several times a year, seeing how well students are progressing toward the agreed upon learning goals. But a really robust set of data is what's going on in the classroom right now. As I plan my lessons, how will I know if students are getting it? And the first part of that conversation is about what is the learning that I want them to achieve, and what will it look like if they've mastered this, if they are understanding it, and what do I need to engage them in doing so they have that opportunity to demonstrate that understanding, and then how can I collect that information in order to give them feedback on where they are right now as a class, as individuals, and how can I use that to make those subtle shifts in what I might be doing in the remaining 20 minutes of this particular lesson. So the most important conversation here is that one that you as a teacher have with your colleagues to say, what is the learning that we want? What will it look like when students have mastered this? And what will I gather as evidence? What can I intentionally plan that will give students that opportunity to demonstrate that, or to acknowledge, you know what, I don't quite get this. And beginning to build that culture where students are okay to say, nope, I don't quite get this. And then you're being given that opportunity beautifully to be able to respond to them. And I see that we have just 1 minute here, so I'm going to go quickly to this last slide to just say there are some wonderful resources out there for ways to use formative assessments, ways to build them right into your lesson, starting with that conversation about what will the learning look like and how will I know when they've gotten it? What is the evidence that I can collect? Which gets me down to the kinds of oral questions that I would ask students and what keywords I might be listening for as they respond and explain their thinking, or as I put them into groups and they're debating across the team, explaining things to one another, what are the key words that I would be listening for. If I give them a writing prompt, if I give them an opportunity to create a model or to do a role play, within doing that, what would give me the feedback that they have gotten this, they understand my thinking, and then what ways can I begin to informally collect that information so that over time I'm really beginning my own repository of effect sizes. I'm beginning to determine for specific students with these learning challenges, here were the teacher moves I made, and these are the ones that actually worked when students started to get it. I'm going to turn it over to you now, Heidi.